Every morning at exactly 6 a.m., Robert Williams walked through the back entrance of the Riverside Community Center with his worn leather bag slung over his shoulder. The same routine for 15 years? Clock in, grab his supplies from the maintenance closet, and begin another day of being completely invisible to the world around him. Robert wasn't the kind of man who demanded attention. At 52 years old, he had learned long ago that life was easier when you kept your head down and did your job well. His uniform was always clean and pressed, his work boots polished despite their age, and his graying beard neatly trimmed. He took pride in his appearance, even if others rarely noticed. The Riverside Community Center was the crown jewel of their small southern town. Built in 1923, it stood like a palace with its white columns and grand entrance. Inside, crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings and thick red carpets covered polished marble floors. This was where the town's most important people came to see concerts, attend charity events, and hold their fancy dinner parties. Robert knew every inch of this building. He could walk through it blindfolded and tell you exactly where each room was located. The small conference rooms on the second floor where the city council met. The kitchen where catered meals were prepared for hundreds of guests. The storage rooms filled with folding chairs and tables for different events. But his favorite place, the place where he spent most of his time, was the grand auditorium. The auditorium could seat 800 people in red velvet chairs arranged in perfect rows. The stage was large enough for a full orchestra with deep, burgundy curtains that could be pulled back to reveal performers to the eager audience below. And there, sitting center stage like a sleeping giant, was the grand piano. It was a Steinway, older than Robert himself, but maintained with the kind of care usually reserved for precious artwork. The black lacquer finish reflected the stage, lights like a mirror, and when the lid was open, you could see the intricate network of strings and hammers that created music. Robert had been cleaning around that piano for 15 years, but he had never been allowed to touch the keys. During the day, the center buzzed with activity. Well-dressed women planned charity luncheons in the meeting rooms. Businessmen in expensive suits discussed community projects over coffee. Music teachers gave private lessons to children whose parents could afford such luxuries. All of them walked past Robert as if he were part of the furniture. He didn't mind, really. Being invisible had its advantages. People said things around him they might not say to others. He learned about their lives, their problems, their joys. He knew which marriages were struggling, which businesses were thriving, and which teenagers were giving their parents the most trouble. Not because he was nosy, but because when you're invisible, people forget you have ears. Mrs. Henderson, the center's director, was a kind enough woman, but she treated Robert like a reliable machine rather than a person. She would leave him lists of tasks to complete, and he would complete them without question. Fix the loose handle on the ladies' room door. Replace the burned-out light bulb in the conference room. Polish the floors in the main hallway until they shined like glass. The other staff members were polite, but distant. They would nod when they passed him in the hallways, maybe offer a quick good morning or thank you when he completed a task. That made their day easier. But real conversations were rare. They lived in different worlds. Even though they worked in the same building, Robert's world was one of early mornings and late nights. He arrived before most people were awake and often stayed long after the last event ended. He had keys to every door and knew the security codes that protected the building's most valuable items. The board of directors trusted him completely with their property. Even if they barely acknowledged his existence. His evenings were when the magic happened, though no one knew about it. After the last guest left and the staff went home, after the lights were dimmed and the doors were locked, Robert would return to the auditorium. Not to clean, but to sit at that beautiful piano and let his fingers dance across the keys. He had taught himself to play when he was 12 years old, using an old upright piano in his grandmother's house. His grandmother, rest her soul, had saved every penny to buy that piano from a church that was closing down. She believed music was food for the soul, and she wanted to make sure her grandson's soul was well fed. Robert learned to read music from library books and practiced every day after school. He played gospel hymns that his grandmother hummed while she cooked Sunday dinner. He taught himself classical pieces by listening to records from the local radio station. Jazz, blues, spirituals, his fingers learned them all, but life had other plans for him. His father died when Robert was 17, leaving behind medical bills and a family that needed support. College became impossible. Professional music training was a dream that faded as quickly as morning mist. Instead, Robert found work where he could get it, using his strong back and willingness to work hard to support his mother and younger sister. 20 years passed before he found the job at the community center. 20 years of factory work, construction, jobs, and whatever else would pay the bills. By then, most people would have given up on their musical dreams entirely. But not Robert. Those dreams had just gone underground, like seeds waiting for the right conditions to grow. Late at night, when the community center was empty and silent, Robert would unlock the auditorium and make his way to the stage. The piano bench creaked slightly under his weight as he sat down. His fingers, rough from years of manual labor, would find the keys like old friends finding each other after a long separation. He played everything he remembered and taught himself new pieces from sheet music he found in the center's music library. Chopin's gentle nocturnes filled the empty space with beauty. Beethoven's powerful sonatas echoed off the walls. Gospel hymns that reminded him of his grandmother's voice brought tears to his eyes. Sometimes he played for hours, losing himself in the music until he realized the sun was beginning to rise outside. He would close the piano lid carefully, make sure everything was exactly as he found it, and begin his regular cleaning duties as if nothing had happened. Nobody knew about these secret concerts. The security cameras in the auditorium had been broken for 3 years, and the board had decided they weren't worth replacing since nothing valuable had ever been stolen. The building was old enough that sound didn't travel well between floors. So his music stayed trapped in the auditorium like a beautiful secret Robert never dreamed of performing for others. That part of his life felt closed off, like a door that had been locked so long he'd forgotten where he put the key. He was content to play for an audience of empty chairs and his own memories. The music was enough. It kept the dream alive, even if no one else would ever hear it. This was Robert's life, invisible by day, alive by night, carrying a secret that was both his greatest joy and his deepest loneliness. He had no idea that everything was about to change, or that one unexpected evening would finally unlock that door he thought was sealed forever. The third Saturday of October was always the biggest night of the year at the Riverside Community Center. The annual Harvest Gala brought together everyone who was anyone in town. Tonight was no different. Robert had been preparing for this event all week, making sure every surface gleamed and every detail was perfect. By 5 in the evening, the parking lot was already filling up with expensive cars. Mercedes, BMWs, and Cadillacs lined up like shiny jewels under the streetlights. Men in black tuxedos helped women in sparkling evening gowns out of their vehicles. The October air was crisp, and you could see their breath as they laughed and chatted on their way to the entrance. Robert watched from the service entrance as he carried in the last of the extra chairs. These people represented millions of dollars in local business, political influence, and social power. The mayor was coming, along with the bank president, the owner of the largest manufacturing plant in the county, and dozens of other important figures. This wasn't just a party, it was the social event that would be talked about for months inside. The community center had been transformed into something magical. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables decorated with autumn flowers and golden linens. The smell of expensive perfume mixed with the aroma of gourmet food being prepared in the kitchen. Servers in crisp white uniforms practiced carrying trays of champagne glasses, making sure they could navigate between tables without spilling a drop. Mrs. Henderson, the center's director, was everywhere at once. She wore a navy blue dress that probably cost more than Robert made in a month, and her gray hair was styled in an elegant updo. She carried a clipboard and checked items off her list as she supervised the final preparations. The caterers had arrived early and were arranging an impressive display of food. The florist was making last-minute adjustments to the centerpieces. Everything had to be absolutely perfect. Robert stayed in the background, as always. His job tonight was to be available if anything went wrong. A spilled drink that needed immediate attention, a clogged toilet in the restroom, a broken chair that needed quick replacement. He wore his best uniform, the one reserved for special events, and carried a small radio so the staff could reach him if needed. The guests began arriving at 6:30, and Robert could hear the buzz of conversation and laughter growing louder as the auditorium filled up. Through the service door window, he caught glimpses of the elegant crowd. Women showed off their jewelry and designer dresses while men discussed business deals and golf scores. Everyone seemed to know everyone else, greeting each other with warm hugs and air kisses. The evening's schedule was carefully planned, cocktails, and mingling from 6:30 to 7:30. Dinner would be served at 8, followed by the fundraising presentation at 9. And then, at 9:30, the highlight of the evening, a piano performance by Professor Mitchell from the State University's music department. He was supposed to play classical pieces while people enjoyed dessert and made their final donations to the community center's renovation fund. At 7:15. Robert was in the supply closet organizing cleaning supplies when Mrs. Henderson's voice crackled through his radio. She sounded stressed, which was unusual for someone who normally handled everything with calm efficiency. "Robert, please come to my office immediately. We have a situation." He found Mrs. Henderson pacing behind her desk, her phone pressed to her ear. Her face was pale, and the calm control she usually maintained was nowhere to be seen. She was talking to someone, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Are you absolutely certain? There's no way you can make it?" She paused, listening. "I understand. Yes, I hope you feel better soon." She hung up and looked at Robert with the expression of someone who had just watched their carefully laid plans crumble into dust. "Professor Mitchell has food poisoning," she said, her voice shaking. "Slightly. He's in the emergency room. He won't be able to perform tonight." Robert felt genuinely sorry for her. He knew how much work had gone into planning this event, how much money they hoped to raise, and how important the evening was for the community center's future. But he wasn't sure why she was telling him this. What could he possibly do to help with a missing piano player? Mrs. Henderson continued pacing, thinking out loud more than talking to him. "The whole evening is planned around that performance. People are expecting it. The program lists it. We've already announced it." She stopped and looked directly at Robert. "We need someone to play that piano tonight." Robert felt uncomfortable under her stare. "Ma'am, I'm sure you can find someone, maybe one of the music teachers in town, or perhaps someone in the audience plays piano." Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "I've already called every pianist I know. It's Saturday night, and they're all busy with their own performances or out of town. The music teachers are either here as guests or unavailable." She paused, and Robert could see her mind working. "Wait, didn't someone tell me you played piano?" Robert's stomach dropped. He had been so careful to keep his secret for 15 years. Who could have seen him? Who could have told her? I don't know what you mean, Nan. Betty from the cleaning service mentioned something about hearing piano music late at night sometimes. She thought maybe you knew how to play. Mrs. Henderson's eyes were locked on his face, studying his reaction. Robert felt trapped. Betty cleaned the offices upstairs twice a week and sometimes worked late. She must have heard him playing and put two and two together. "Mrs. Henderson, I really don't think—" "Robert, I'm desperate here." Her voice took on a pleading tone he had never heard from her before. "I've got 300 people out there who paid $200 a plate for this dinner. They're expecting entertainment. The success of our fundraising depends on this evening going smoothly." Robert tried to explain without revealing too much. "Even if I could play a little, ma'am, I'm not a performer. I'm the maintenance man. I don't have the right clothes, the right training, the right—" Mrs. Henderson interrupted him. "Robert, you've worked here for 15 years. You've never let me down, not once. I'm not asking you to perform a concert. Just play some background music during dessert. Something simple and pleasant, please." The weight of her desperation was crushing. Robert looked at this woman who had given him steady employment and decent treatment for 15 years. She had never asked him for anything beyond his regular duties. Now she was practically begging. "Mrs. Henderson, I really don't think the guests would appreciate. They'll appreciate having music instead of awkward silence," she said firmly. Then her voice softened again. "Robert, I'm asking you as a favor, a personal favor. Will you help me save this evening?" Robert felt his carefully constructed world shifting beneath his feet. The secret he had guarded so carefully was about to be exposed to 300 of the most influential people in town. He would be standing in front of people who barely acknowledged his existence, wearing his maintenance uniform, trying to provide entertainment they expected from a professional musician, but looking at Mrs. Henderson's face, seeing the real panic and desperation there, he found himself nodding slowly. "I'll try, ma'am, but I can't promise anything. And if it doesn't work out, it will work out," she said quickly, relief flooding her voice. "It has to. Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much." As he walked back toward the auditorium, Robert's hands were already shaking. In 30 minutes he would be sitting at that piano, not in the quiet darkness of an empty building, but under bright lights in front of hundreds of eyes. Everything he had kept hidden was about to be revealed, whether he was ready or not. Robert stood in the wings of the stage, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. Through a gap in the curtains, he could see the audience finishing their main course. Crystal glasses clinked against china plates as servers moved efficiently between tables. The sound of 300 conversations created a steady hum that filled the auditorium. He looked down at his uniform, the same navy blue shirt and pants he wore every day, with Riverside Community Center embroidered on the chest pocket. His work boots were polished, but they were still work boots. His hands, calloused from years of manual labor, were trembling slightly. This was not how he had ever imagined his first public performance. Mrs. Henderson appeared beside him, checking her watch nervously. "The dessert course will be served in 10 minutes, she whispered. "Are you ready? Ready?" Robert almost laughed at the question. How could anyone be ready for something like this? He had spent 15 years playing in secret, alone with his music and his memories. Now he was about to expose that private world to people who saw him as nothing more than the help. "Mrs. Henderson," he said quietly, "maybe we should reconsider. I could just put on some recorded music instead. Most people wouldn't even notice the difference." She shook her head firmly. "The program specifically mentions a live piano performance. These people paid good money expecting live entertainment." She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Robert, I've heard you play. Late one evening about a month ago, I came back to get some files I'd forgotten. The music coming from the auditorium was beautiful. I knew it had to be you." Robert felt his face flush with embarrassment. Another person who knew his secret. How many others had heard him over the years without saying anything? Mrs. Henderson continued, "You're better than you think you are. Just play from your heart like you do when you think no one is listening." The servers were beginning to clear the dinner plates, and Robert could see the dessert course being prepared in the wings on the other side of the stage. Small tables held hundreds of individual chocolate mousse cups garnished with fresh berries and mint leaves. The guests would be expecting their entertainment to begin soon. Robert closed his eyes and tried to calm his racing thoughts. He remembered his grandmother's voice from all those years ago. "Music isn't about impressing people, baby. It's about sharing something beautiful. When you sit down at those keys, you're not performing, you're having a conversation with God, and other people just get to listen in." But this felt different. These weren't the empty chairs he was used to playing for. These were real people, with expectations and judgments. People who had never seen him as anything more than the man who mopped their floors and emptied their trash cans. Through the curtain gap, he could see familiar faces. Mr. Thompson, who owned the biggest bank in town, was laughing at something his wife had said. Mrs. Williams, the mayor's wife, was showing off her new diamond bracelet to the women at her table. Dr. Peterson, who ran the medical clinic, was deep in conversation with the owner of the local newspaper. These people lived in a world Robert could only observe from the outside. They attended private clubs he could never afford to join. They sent their children to expensive colleges he could never have attended. They drove cars that cost more than he made in several years, and now he was supposed to entertain them. The dessert servers were taking their positions. Mrs. Henderson gave him one last, encouraging smile before hurrying out to introduce him to the audience. Robert heard her voice over the sound system, bright and confident despite the crisis they had just weathered. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this wonderful meal prepared by our talented catering team. Before we move on to dessert and our fundraising presentation, we have a special treat for you this evening. Robert's palms were sweating now. Special treat? He felt more like a desperate last resort. Mrs. Henderson continued, Our entertainment tonight comes from someone you all know, though perhaps not in this capacity. Robert Williams has been part of our Riverside Community Center family for 15 years, keeping our beautiful facility in perfect condition. What many of you don't know is that Robert is also an accomplished pianist. Tonight, he's graciously agreed to share his musical gifts with us. The applause that followed was polite but uncertain. Robert could almost hear the questions in people's minds. The custodian, playing piano? How good could he possibly be? Mrs. Henderson gestured toward the wings where Robert was standing. This was it. No turning back now? He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked out onto the stage. The stage lights were brighter than he had expected, and for a moment he was nearly blinded. As his eyes adjusted, he could see hundreds of faces looking up at him, with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism to barely concealed amusement. He heard someone whisper, "Is this some kind of joke?" Robert walked to the piano bench with as much dignity as he could manage. His work boots echoed on the wooden stage floor, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet of the auditorium. When he reached the piano, he paused for a moment, his hand resting on the lid. This instrument had been his secret companion for so many years. Late at night, when the building was empty and dark, this piano had been his closest friend. They had shared countless hours together, just the two of them exploring melodies and harmonies that no one else had ever heard. Now, under the bright lights and watchful eyes of 300 people, the piano seemed different, somehow larger, more intimidating. The black and white keys that had always felt so familiar under his fingers now looked like a foreign language he wasn't sure he remembered how to speak. Robert sat down on the bench and adjusted its height slightly, a habit from his nighttime practice sessions. The familiar weight of the keys under his fingers should have been comforting, but instead, everything felt strange and exposed. He looked out at the audience one more time. The conversations had completely stopped now. Even the servers had paused in their work to watch. 300 pairs of eyes were focused on him, waiting to see what the maintenance man could possibly do with this beautiful instrument. Some faces showed genuine curiosity. Others displayed the kind of polite attention you give to a child's school recital, prepared to clap encouragingly regardless of the quality of the performance. A few people were checking their phones or whispering to their companions, clearly expecting to be disappointed. Robert placed his hands in position over the keys and closed his eyes for just a moment. In his mind, he was back in his grandmother's living room, sitting at that old upright piano she had saved so hard to buy. He could almost hear her voice. "Don't think about who's listening, baby. Just let the music flow through you like it always has." When he opened his eyes again, something had shifted. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something stronger. 15 years of love for this music, 15 years of secret practice, 15 years of keeping this part of himself alive despite everything that had tried to kill it. Robert took one final deep breath, positioned his fingers over the keys, and began to play. The first notes that flowed from Robert's fingers were soft and gentle, like a whisper in the wind. He had chosen Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece he had practiced countless times in the empty auditorium, but never imagined playing for anyone else. The melody began simply, almost hesitantly, as if the music itself was unsure about being heard. At first, the audience continued their quiet conversations. Forks clinked against dessert plates as people tasted their chocolate mousse. Someone coughed softly. A chair creaked as someone shifted their position. The music was pleasant background noise, exactly what they expected from the maintenance man trying his best to fill in for a real pianist, but as Robert's fingers found their confidence, something magical began to happen. The simple melody started to grow and breathe, taking on a life of its own. His left hand added a gentle bass line that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, while his right hand danced through the higher notes with surprising grace and skill. Mrs. Patterson, who taught piano lessons to half the wealthy children in town, was the first to really notice. She had been politely listening while chatting with her dinner companion when something in the music made her stop mid-sentence. Her trained ear recognized not just the correct notes, but the subtle expression and phrasing that separated true musicians from people who simply knew how to press keys. She leaned forward in her chair, her full attention now focused on the man at the piano. This wasn't amateur playing. This was artistry. The transformation in the room happened slowly, like dawn breaking across a quiet lake. One by one, conversations died away as people became aware that something extraordinary was happening on stage. The businessman who had been checking his phone slipped it back into his pocket. The mayor's wife stopped adjusting her jewelry and turned toward the piano. Robert himself seemed to transform as he played. The nervous, uncertain man who had walked onto the stage was disappearing, replaced by someone who belonged at that piano bench. His shoulders relaxed and his whole body moved with the rhythm of the music. This was where he was meant to be, and everyone in the room could feel it. The nocturne reached its most challenging passage, where most amateur pianists would stumble or slow down. Instead, Robert's fingers flew across the keys with precision and grace that took the breath away from everyone watching. The melody soared and dipped like a bird riding the wind, each note perfectly placed and beautifully shaped. Dr. Peterson, who had attended classical concerts in major cities around the world, found himself leaning forward in amazement. He had heard this piece performed by professional pianists in symphony halls, but rarely with such deep emotion and understanding. The custodian wasn't just playing the notes, he was telling a story with the music. As the nocturne drew to a close, the last notes floating gently in the air like the final leaves falling from an autumn tree, something unprecedented happened. The entire auditorium fell into complete silence. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for something to end, but the profound silence of people who had just witnessed something beautiful and unexpected. For a moment, Robert sat motionless at the piano, his hands still resting on the keys. He looked out at the audience and saw something in their faces he had never seen before. They were looking at him, really looking at him, for the first time in 15 years, but Robert wasn't finished. Without announcement or explanation, he transitioned into something completely different. His fingers found the opening chords of Take 5 by Dave Brubeck, transforming the classical atmosphere into something cool and sophisticated. The unusual time signature that made most pianists nervous felt natural under his hands, and he began to improvise around the melody with the confidence of someone who had been playing jazz for decades. The audience was stunned. They had barely recovered from the classical performance when they were hit with jazz improvisation that belonged in the finest clubs in New Orleans or New York. Robert's left hand walked through complex bass lines while his right hand explored melodic variations that were both technically impressive and emotionally moving. Young Andrew Miller, home from college where he studied music composition, watched with his mouth literally hanging open. He had struggled with jazz improvisation in his classes, spending hours trying to understand the theory and technique that seemed to flow so naturally from the fingers of the man in the maintenance uniform. The jazz piece flowed seamlessly into a gospel hymn that Robert's grandmother used to sing while she worked in her kitchen. How Great Thou Art filled the auditorium with a power and beauty that brought tears to many eyes. This wasn't the polite, restrained version they heard in their formal church services. This was music that came from the soul, filled with joy and pain and hope and faith all mixed together. Mrs. Rodriguez, who directed the church choir at St. Mary's, felt her heart swell with emotion. She had heard this hymn arranged for full choirs, and orchestras, but never with such personal meaning and spiritual depth. The custodian was preaching through the piano, sharing his faith and his journey through every note. Robert's hands moved to Georgia on My Mind, transforming the auditorium into an intimate jazz club. His interpretation was both respectful to the original and entirely his own, with subtle changes in rhythm and harmony that showed his deep understanding of the music's structure and meaning. The audience was completely captivated now. Dessert. Plates sat forgotten as people leaned forward to catch every note. The mayor found himself thinking about his own abandoned dreams of becoming a musician. The bank president remembered the piano lessons he had quit as a child, wondering what might have been if he had stuck with it for his final piece. Robert returned to classical music, but this time he chose something that would showcase the full power of both the piano and his abilities. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata began with those famous, haunting opening notes that everyone recognized, even if they didn't know the name of the piece. But when Robert reached the explosive third movement, the auditorium erupted with sound and energy that no one had expected. His fingers flew across the keys with breathtaking speed and precision, building to climaxes that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. This wasn't just piano playing, this was a force of nature unleashed through music. The technical demands of the piece were staggering, but Robert handled them with ease, adding his own interpretive touches that made the familiar music sound fresh and exciting. Every person in that room knew they were witnessing something rare and special, something they would remember and talk about for the rest of their lives. When the final thunderous chord rang out and slowly faded into silence, the auditorium remained quiet for what felt like an eternity. 300 people sat in stunned amazement, trying to process what they had just experienced. The custodian they had barely noticed for 15 years had just delivered a performance that rivaled anything they had ever heard from professional musicians. The silence that followed Robert's final chord seemed to stretch on forever. 300 people sat frozen in their chairs, as if moving might somehow break the spell that had been cast over the entire auditorium. Robert himself remained at the piano bench, his hands still resting on the keys, unsure of what would happen next. Then Mayor Davidson began to clap. Slowly at first, his hands coming together in a rhythm that seemed to echo through the vast space. Within seconds, Mrs. Patterson joined him, then Dr. Peterson, then Mrs. Rodriguez, like a wave spreading across the ocean. The applause grew and spread until every single person in that auditorium was on their feet, clapping with an intensity that shook the building. But this wasn't the polite applause that usually followed performances at community center events. This was something raw and emotional, filled with surprise and respect and even a little shame. These people were applauding not just the music they had heard, but their own awakening to the fact that they had been blind to the talent that had been walking among them for 15 years. Robert stood up slowly, overwhelmed by the response. He had never experienced anything like this. The sound of all those hands clapping seemed to wash over him like a warm wave, and for a moment he felt dizzy with the intensity of it all. He gave a small, humble bow, then looked out at the sea of faces that were now seeing him completely differently than they had just 1 hour before. The applause continued for what felt like 10 minutes, though it was probably closer to 3. People whistled and cheered, and several audience members had tears streaming down their faces. Mrs. Henderson stood in the wings with her own eyes wet, partly from relief that the evening had been saved, but mostly from pride in this man who had just revealed himself to be so much more than anyone had imagined. When the applause finally began to die down, something unprecedented happened. Instead of returning to their seats for the planned fundraising presentation, people began moving toward the stage. They wanted to speak to Robert, to shake his hand, to somehow connect with the person who had just changed their entire understanding of hidden talent and human worth. Mr. Thompson, the bank president, was one of the first to reach him. This was a man who had walked past Robert countless times without so much as a nod, but now he grasped Robert's hand with both of his own and looked directly into his eyes. "Robert, I owe you an apology," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been coming to this building for years, and I never really saw you. Tonight you've opened my eyes not just to your incredible talent, but to my own blindness. That was extraordinary. Dr. Peterson was next, shaking his head in amazement. I've attended concerts at Carnegie Hall and the Kennedy Center, Robert. What you just did belongs on those stages? Where did you learn to play like that? Robert found his voice, though it was shaky with emotion. My grandmother taught me to start when I was young, but mostly I've been teaching myself all these years. I practice here sometimes, late at night when everyone's gone home. Mrs. Patterson, the piano teacher, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. Robert, I've been teaching piano for 30 years, and I've never heard anything like what you just played. The emotion, the technique, the interpretation, it was absolutely beautiful. Have you ever considered teaching? Young Andrew Miller pushed through the crowd, his face bright with excitement. Mr. Williams, I'm studying music composition at the State University. Would you be willing to talk to me about jazz improvisation? The way you played tonight, it's exactly what I've been trying to learn. One by one, people who had never spoken. To Robert, beyond a polite good morning, were now engaging with him as an equal, as an artist, as someone whose opinion and friendship they suddenly valued. The maintenance uniform that had made him invisible for so long now seemed irrelevant. They were seeing the person inside the uniform for the first time. Mrs. Rodriguez approached with a proposal that would change everything. Robert, our church has been looking for a new music director. Our current pianist is moving away next month. Would you consider auditioning for the position? It pays well, and you'd have access to our beautiful pipe organ, too. Robert was overwhelmed by the offer. A real music position? After all these years of playing in secret, someone was actually offering him a chance to make music his profession. But the evening's surprises weren't over. Mrs. Henderson took the microphone and addressed the crowd that was still gathered around the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. I think we can all agree that tonight has been special in ways we never expected. Robert Williams has shown us that talent and dignity exist in places we might never think to look. I'd like to propose something. She paused, making sure she had everyone's attention. Our renovation fund drive has a goal of raising $50,000 tonight, but I think we should do something more. I'd like to establish the Robert Williams Music Education Scholarship to help young people from families who might not otherwise be able to afford music lessons pursue their musical dreams. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. People began reaching for their checkbooks and phones to make donations on the spot. Mr. Thompson stepped forward and announced he would personally contribute $10,000 to start the scholarship fund. Dr. Peterson followed with $5,000. Within minutes, pledges were flowing in from all around the auditorium. The local newspaper editor, who had been taking notes throughout the evening, approached Robert with an interview request. This story needs to be told, she said. Not just locally, but I think the regional papers would be interested too. Would you be willing to talk to me about your musical journey? As the crowd finally began to thin out and people started heading home, Robert found himself sitting alone at the piano once more. But this time it felt completely different. The instrument that had been his secret companion for so many years was now the bridge that had connected him to his community in ways he had never dreamed possible. Mrs. Henderson approached him as he was gathering his things. Robert, I hope you know that everything has changed tonight. You don't have to keep being invisible if you don't want to. You have gifts that the world needs to hear. Robert smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. Mrs. Henderson, I think I'd like to keep my day job here, if that's all right with you. This place has been good to me. But maybe I could also teach some piano lessons in the evenings and play at church on Sundays. I think that sounds perfect, she replied. And Robert, thank you for saving our evening. But more than that, thank you for reminding all of us that we should never stop looking for the extraordinary in the ordinary. 6 months later, Robert was indeed teaching piano lessons 3 evenings a week in one of the community center's smaller rooms. The scholarship fund had grown to over $100,000, helping dozens of young musicians pursue their dreams. He played at St. Mary's every Sunday, and his monthly evening concerts at the community center were always sold out. But perhaps the most important change was in how people saw each other. Robert's revelation had sparked conversations throughout the town about hidden talents and overlooked potential. Teachers paid closer attention to quiet students. Employers looked more carefully at the skills and interests of their workers. Everyone began to wonder what amazing abilities might be hidden in the people they passed every day. Robert still cleaned the community center each morning, but now he did it with a sense of joy and belonging he had never felt before. He was no longer invisible. He was valued, respected, and loved for all of who he was. And late at night, when he played that beautiful piano in the empty auditorium, he was no longer alone with his music. He carried with him the memory of 300 people discovering that miracles can happen when we finally learn to truly see each other.